When leveraging its advanced feature set, we all know that Unreal Engine 5 is quite the demanding engine. Just reaching 60 frames per second while utilizing Lumen and Nanite is a serious challenge for developers. So of course, with Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, Team Ninja opted for Master Ninja difficulty and decided to combine Lumen and Nanite while targeting 120 frames per second gameplay on a console. Did they manage it? But this is just one of the interesting things I want to discuss today about this new version of Ninja Gaiden 2. After all, Ninja Gaiden 2 Black marks the return of the second modern entry in the Ninja Gaiden franchise, as the final Team Ninja game, helmed by Tomonobu Itagaki. The original 360 version kicked players in the teeth and left them begging for more. It's a beloved yet tough-as-nails action game that also happened to be riddled with technical and balance issues. Yet with its insane enemy counts, dismemberment system, and intense speed, it rewarded those who stuck with it. And then things got a little weird with Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. Released initially for PlayStation 3, Sigma 2 serves as the basis for each new release going forward. It's a more polished game with more content, but at the same time has its own issues. Enemy numbers are massively reduced, damage and HP values tweaked, and the glorious showers of blood removed entirely. Which brings us to Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. Shadow dropped after the Xbox Developer Direct, this new version of Ninja Gaiden 2 caught my attention. Fans of the series understand the weight of expectation that comes with the name Black, after all. So, is it worthy? Let's find out. Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is a curious release. You see, this is fundamentally similar to Bluepoint's work on games such as Demon's Souls and Shadow of the Colossus. That is, it's a visual remake which combines the original underlying game engine and technology with an entirely new rendering presentation, this time powered by Unreal Engine 5. But that's not even the full story. You see, this isn't just a prettier version of Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. Instead, it feels as if the development team went in and pulled elements from all the versions of Ninja Gaiden 2 to create something that feels somewhat new and fresh. One change is the return of the limb severing system and liters of blood that went missing in Sigma. For all the sickos out there, the blood system this time is extremely over the top, with every slice of the dragon sword filling the air with showers of blood that then pool on the floor, eventually drying up if you wait long enough. But this system originally tied into the combat itself. Enemies in the Xbox 360 game appear in larger numbers, but can be killed faster, or at least their limbs can be chopped off, creating a different type of threat. From what I can tell, 2 Black seems to walk somewhere in between the two, siding closer to Sigma 2. There are still fewer enemies overall compared to Xbox 360, but then there's scenes where it exceeds what we saw in Sigma 2. 2 Black also includes the easier to use bow and arrow system, various changes to the level designs, and the extra stages from Sigma 2, though not all of the bosses made the cut, such as the Buddha boss in the first stage or the Statue of Liberty. The key here is that the development team did put work into rebalance and change the game as they saw fit, which is commendable. This is not just another version of Sigma 2, it is something unique. One of the things I was curious about though is how it visually compares to the original Xbox 360 version of the game. Many people have already made the comparison with Sigma 2, but it's that original version running on real hardware that I wanted to compare against. By and large, I think the new version does look significantly better, but there are areas where the 360 version stands strong. During the introduction cutscene, and in fact the first area in general, I tend to think that the skybox on 360 is more visually striking, even though it's basically just a texture. The new game just doesn't capture the look of light pollution from a large city, which is interesting because they actually went through the trouble to build out this massive metropolis into Black. It extends way off into the horizon, which does at least lend it some additional depth, even if it doesn't look quite as convincing lighting-wise. The rest of the visual quality, though, is largely boosted. Character models in particular look significantly better, I think, aside from perhaps the artifacts visible across the hair, which is unfortunately a side effect that we'll talk about shortly. On the other hand, I do think it's a shame that the original credit sequence was removed from this intro. That may have been the case in Sigma as well. I always enjoyed the timing of the various staff names to the action. It all felt very cinematic, especially when Itagaki's name appears on screen, which, by the way, I feel like they got the focus wrong here. In the original version, Ryu is seen out of focus as he walks up for the kill. It's reversed in the newer version. A minor thing, but kind of interesting to note. Now, the rest of the stage largely looks superior in my eyes. The lighting is better, there's more geometric detail, and everything just feels more cohesive, aside from the aforementioned skybox issue. This new version also receives true volumetric lighting, while these effects are faked in the original 360 version and appear dithered due to the lower color depth. Once inside the building, a combination of lumen reflections and SSR are used for the shiny floors, whereas Xbox 360 just uses a subtle specular sheen to give it that shininess. The scene before the final boss also does a really nice job showing off the volumetric lighting streaming in through the window here, not to mention the overall increased level of detail on the character models. The skin rendering in particular looks a lot more realistic in the new version. Everyone in the original has this sort of doll-like complexion that was common with Team Ninja games of the era. I did notice though, once you face off against this first boss, the way shadows are depicted here using Unreal Engine 5 can result in some noisy, dithered artifacts across the floor of the arena. But the overall fight looks better, I think. The second mission then is rather curious as the time of day is completely different, but this was a change introduced in Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2. This cutscene here looks significantly better in the new version thanks to improved character rendering, fire effects, and lighting. It's definitely a case where modern lighting techniques lend the scene a new intensity. Not that the original does a poor job or anything, it still looks pretty good. Now once we drop into gameplay, let's wait here for a second. This first scene really highlights the benefits of the new game. The scene geometry is massively boosted and everything is just much more detailed, yet it still retains that same basic layout. It does use that different time of day that was introduced in Sigma 2, but honestly I think it looks significantly better here on the left. That said, I did notice some issues with detail streaming where certain meshes like this appear lower detail for reasons that aren't entirely clear. What's worse is that it happens across every single version, including PC. Running up these steps here, you can see that there's more geometric detail once again, and the time of day drastically alters the overall mood of the scene. Do you see Mount Fuji here in the background, by the way, on 360? Well, like the city stage, the entire skybox area has been fully modeled out in 3D in the new game. It's a neat touch that lends the game some additional depth when looking out across the world. Now, the rest of the stage follows the basic visual changes we've observed thus far, but once we enter the castle, I do appreciate the Lumen GI visible here in this hallway. With the sunshine pouring in, you get that beautiful indirect lighting. But really, these sorts of differences sort of persist throughout the game. The original was carefully designed with a very specific look, but 2 Black integrates modern rendering techniques. And while it often looks better, there are certainly areas where it feels like there's a slight mismatch. It's an overall win, but it is interesting to see how it's changed as a result of this. Whereas everything in the 360 game was baked and designed to look specifically exactly that way. But the DNA of the original game persists below the surface. You see, much like Namco's Tekken 8, the gameplay itself is handled by a different underlying engine, in this case Ninja Gaiden Sigma 2's engine, but all the rendering stuff is instead handled by Unreal Engine 5. What this means in practice is that the game plays authentically, but benefits from beautiful new lighting thanks to Lumen, while Nanite ensures no visible LOD pop-in during gameplay, at least on Nanite-enabled LODs anyway. All console versions of the game feature software Lumen and Nanite, including Xbox Series S. When playing on PS5, PS5 Pro, and Xbox Series X, players also have the choice between 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. We'll get into the performance numbers a bit later, but all consoles do seem to use Epic's TSR for upsampling with variable internal resolutions. When using the 60 FPS mode, the PS5, PS5 Pro, and Series X all target 4K, upsampled using TSR. The 120 FPS mode, however, targets just 1080p, and this includes the HUD and everything, so the whole front buffer switches to 1080p. And then it's once again upsampled from a lower resolution. The Series S version only has one mode, and that is also 1080p. This is a game, though, that in some ways demonstrates the limitations of modern upsampling and temporal techniques. With a high input resolution, results are fine, especially on PS5 Pro, which seems to be noticeably sharper than other versions in action. The problems show up though with the lower resolution modes, especially on Series S, which at a max of 60 FPS has fewer frames to work with. Image quality is so bad in that case that I would almost consider it worse than the Xbox 360 original, because there's basically not enough native pixel data to work with, and thus, when combined with the ultra-fast motion of this game, the results are downright ugly at times. The 120 FPS mode has similar issues across the other machines, but since the frame rate's higher, there's more data to work with, so the results are less egregious. But it's not just the TAA or upsampling, there's also issues with Lumen itself. Like here on the PC version, you can observe visible ghosting against this wall due to the way Lumen denoises itself. There's no real way to eliminate this, unfortunately. Otherwise, when talking consoles, the visual quality is nearly identical. The 60 FPS modes, for instance, on PS5, Pro, and Series X, all basically look identical. The 120 FPS mode and the Series S version both have a reduction in terms of overall detail of non-nanite geometry and things like shadows, which draw in very close to the camera. Like look at here on Series S. As I walk around this tree, you can see all that shadow detail popping in right before you. So this brings us back to that introduction then. Can these consoles really handle 120 FPS with Lumen and nanite? Well, in terms of image quality, I would say just barely. The sacrifices required here are significant, and image quality is extremely poor if you're playing on a larger 4K display. On a small 1080p monitor though, it's not too bad. So how does it actually run then? Well, in the end, when comparing the three consoles boasting 120 FPS support, the PS5 Pro version runs the fastest. PS5 is slightly behind this on average, and Series X comes in third. Unfortunately, no version is able to hold 120 FPS during gameplay, and as a result, the frame rate is highly variable. The problem here is that the game does not play nicely with frame rates that fail to lock to 30, 60, or 120. Anything in between presents with judder, regardless of whether you have VRR enabled. It's just an issue with how the game seems to work, and this also extends to the PC version. Thus, I don't really recommend using the 120Hz mode at all. The hit to image quality and unstable performance just isn't all that desirable. So the answer is, unfortunately, no. The consoles really cannot comfortably handle this game at 120 FPS with Lumen and nanite. I tip my hat to Team Ninja for trying, because this is a very ambitious goal and something that no other developer has really attempted yet. They are the first to make this combination. That said, some stages fare significantly better than others. The Aqua Capital stage, for instance, manages to run mostly at a stable 120 frames per second, but still, by and large, the hit to image quality and performance takes quite a toll on the experience, and I recommend playing at 60 FPS. Of course, based on my PC experiences, this really comes as no great surprise to me, but we'll talk about that version soon. When running at 60 FPS, however, the results are excellent. PS5, Pro, and Series X all do a great job of locking to 60 FPS during normal gameplay, while offering great image quality. Even the Series S version, while it suffers in terms of visual quality, runs like a dream during gameplay. It's significantly better than any of the original releases of the game as well, so as a result, this is really the mode that I suggest everyone use. 60 FPS, especially a locked 60 FPS, is perfect for Ninja Gaiden 2. The PS5 Pro version especially looks nice thanks to the boost in image clarity that you get over the other versions, though it doesn't really seem to have any other enhancements over this. Given the troubles around PSSR, perhaps that's why they did not implement it in this version of the game. When we get into cutscenes though, we can get a better understanding of the performance differential. This cutscene here is one of the more expensive ones in the game, and based on testing, it averages out to 56.7 frames per second on PS5 Pro, 51.24 FPS on PS5, and 47.13 FPS on Xbox Series X. Series S is also interesting here, as despite the much lower resolution, it performs the worst by far, with an average of 44 frames per second for this cutscene. At this very low resolution and frame rate, the image quality just becomes a mess on the Series S, with a garbled mess of pixels and artifacts everywhere. It just feels like a step too far. Still, the main takeaway here is that when playing at 60 FPS, all console versions do at least manage to deliver 60 FPS gameplay. pretty much locked, and that's critical. The 120 FPS mode is not as smooth as it should be, and the cutscene performance is rather variable, but still, you'll get an experience that runs better than the original versions ever could. But now I'd like to talk briefly about my PC experience. I'm not Alex, so we're not going to get into tremendous detail here, but I did note some interesting things. So firstly, as you'd expect, the PC version can be the best looking version of the bunch. The options menu is robust and you can crank up the settings beyond any of the console versions. You also have more upsampling options and the ability to play at native res if you choose. The Xbox Store version, playable through Game Pass, was initially missing DLSS and XESS, but they've since patched these in, which is great. DLAA and DLSS produce the best results in my experience. Flickering artifacts and noise are minimized compared to every other option. If I zoom in here, you can see what I'm talking about along the facade of this building. DLSS produces the most stable image, and this is just using balance mode across all the different options. Heck, I even tested DLSS Ultra Performance versus native resolution with TAA versus DLAA, and as you can see, DLSS produces superior results. But one of the features that jumped out at me on PC is the addition of a ray tracing checkbox in the menu. So what the heck does this do? Well, Lumen, as seen in the console versions, is a software-based form of ray tracing, and that's what the PC version defaults to. The extra ray tracing option, however, here is hardware Lumen support. Unfortunately, the results are not quite what I had hoped. So to understand it, let's look at what software Lumen gets you in the game. Now, 2 Black includes many reflective surfaces, water, stone floors, marble floors, and more. They're used throughout the adventure. With software Lumen, the game traces against a signed distance field representation of the game world, which looks like this. It's approximate, but it does a good job of representing the basic look of the scene. The caveat here is that it does not include the dynamic characters. So, in-game, Lumen reflections are combined with screen space reflections to create the final output. With hardware Lumen enabled, the PC version now can trace into a geometric representation of the scene instead of an SDF, and this includes the characters. So it could potentially fix the faults in the default mode. Unfortunately, if we peek at the Lumen debug view when using hardware mode, I noticed that the scene being traced is actually missing a lot of detail that is present in the SDF reflections. Trees, for instance, lack approximation of leaves. Character models are factored in, of course, but without any color detail. It's just black silhouettes. Worse still, SSR remains enabled, which can produce some awkward artifacts like this, which you really don't want to see when using hardware Lumen. As a result, on PC, I would suggest using the default software Lumen mode. It looks more consistent overall and is clearly what the game was designed with. Hopefully they can patch the hardware mode though to improve the visual output, because it is more expensive to use. Another nitpick with the PC version though is the poor implementation of frame generation. So both the DLSS and FSR variants are here, but neither really works properly, at least to my eye. What do I mean? Well, it's tough to show here in this video, but basically there's visible judder and lack of fluidity evident when using it. This might be related to the game's need to perfectly lock to 3060 or 120, and the latency mitigation features used by DLSS FrameGen and FSR FrameGen mean that the target frame rate can fall just below 120 FPS, and maybe that's what's causing the issue. I'm not entirely sure here, but I was unable to use any of them smoothly, so I had to disable them. The question is though, why the heck would you want to use FrameGen in a game like Ninja Gaiden 2? Well, fundamentally, it's because the game seems to be quite heavy on the CPU. Now, I'm still using what is now a mid-range CPU, the Intel 12900K, and 120 FPS is off the table, requiring me to cap the game at 60 FPS instead to achieve smooth, consistent play. At least at 60 you can leverage DLAA and crank up the settings all the way, but I would love to have hit 120 FPS. There's also mild stutters on the first run and various other hiccups as well. Now, I can't really say that it's necessarily a bad PC version, but it's not where I would have liked to have been. It feels especially disappointing when you slap in a brand new RTX 5090 and you're forced to lock the game at 60 FPS to get decent performance. Let's hope they can improve things in time, because there is a big patch announced coming up in the next month or two. But alright, my overall feeling right now on Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is positive, but with a hint of disappointment. You see, the visual upgrades are largely welcome, and I do prefer this to any other version of Sigma 2, but there's still room for improvement both with the game balance and the technical performance. Still, I'm thrilled that Ninja Gaiden 2 has made a return, and if you've not played it before, give it a shot. It absolutely rules. Furthermore, for those wanting a physical copy of the game, the PS5 version will be receiving an Asian disc release sometime soon, so keep that in mind. And of course, it's also available on Game Pass for both Xbox and PC users, which is great. But anyways, that's all for the moment, so I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.